be the visionaries that you sort of need to get where you want to go with scientific research?
Well, what you really have to do is you have to go back to the origins. There's a lot of people who talk about going back to what the founding fathers talked about. And one of the real magic of the U.S. is a lot of the founding fathers were interested in science and science research and entrepreneurship and building new things. So if you think of the stuff that Jefferson did and his great library and his great architecture, and you think about Franklin and his inventions and his research, and a whole series of the other founding fathers, you just go back to original principles and you say, just follow those.
You mentioned in that Peterson talk and in other talks I've seen online that the whole talk about the fiscal debate is, quote, taking all of the air out of the room. So how do you get lawmakers to listen to these ideas?
I mean, part of the tragedy of what's happening is they're taking your credit card and my credit card, and they're charging everything on it. And they're saying, you know, we're having a great quarter or we're having a great year, and they're basically charging all of that to our kids. And what's important to understand is when you spend today but your kids have to pay later, that's not a tax cut, that's a long-term loan which may have a very high rate of interest and which our kids are going to have to pay. So what you have to think about right now is, do you invest in science? Do you invest in innovation? Do you invest in infrastructure? Or do you invest in paying the current account deficit, which is what we're doing, which is very expensive?
Your primary field is genomics. What does that field encompass, and where do you see it growing in the next 20, 50 years?
I think that the transition happening today in science, you know, during the Korean War, when people were worried about, you know, a possible nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, when people were worried about transitioning all of these soldiers out of World War II, when people were concerned about the U.S.'s role in the world, about Europe, about rebuilding Europe, very few people were paying attention to transitions like these obscure little nerds inside Bell Labs inventing the transistor. But the transistor ended up being one of the biggest single drivers of the global economy because it's led to things like the internet and televisions and our cameras and radios and telephones and all the stuff we use. And it's those transitions which are taking place in the background which really matter. And the biggest transition taking place today is not only in reading and writing in digital code, which is what we've been doing for the last 30 years. The biggest transition in the world today is a transition into reading and writing life code. And that is going to change every business on this planet. So imagine if I were sitting here in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and I told you the single biggest change in the world, the single biggest change in your kids' lives, the single biggest change in the position of relative countries, who's rich and who's poor, is going to be the ability to write in ones and zeros. That would have seemed like a nerdly and obscure argument. But today it turns out to be true because about 99% of the information we transmit today is in digital code, and that's the reason why we don't use vinyl records, and that's the reason why we don't use manual typewriters, and that's the reason why we can use the internet, and that's the reason why you have these wonderful posters out on the internet that says, remember how smart your parents were? They never had access to Google or Wikipedia when they went through school. And today what's happening is we're beginning to understand how the code of a virus is written, how the code of a bacteria is written, how the code of a plant is written, how the code of an animal is written, how the code of a human being is written, even how the code of a politician is written. And as you begin to think about that stuff, what's really interesting and important is very small changes can lead to very big differences. So the difference between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane is a single gene out of 20,000 genes. The difference between a tree that grows at this size and a sequoia is actually a few genes. And as you think about life in those terms, how long human beings live, what the quality of our life is, what diseases we die of, how we feed ourselves, what medicines we take, how we clothe ourselves, how we create energy, all of is going to change in a fundamental way as we begin to understand, read, and write life code.
We have lots of callers and comments waiting for Juan Enriquez, joining us tonight from Newton, Massachusetts. Broder is in New York City. Good evening. You're the first caller up. Go ahead with